Welcome to the live show, Lessons of Vietnam. I'm your host, Bill Dixon, Vietnam 6768. Uh, the title, as you see there, telling the real story of the American War in Vietnam and the men and women who served, strive to be as factual as I can be, putting the show together and so forth, because quite often the real story is stranger than you could come up with in fiction, I believe. But there were so many myths and so forth out there about the Vietnam War. It's important that we get the real story out there. Everybody's allowed their own opinion, but everybody's not necessarily need their own facts. The facts only go so far, even though, like everything else, you can come up with your own idea of what the facts are and how you interpret them. So, but I just wanted to go over that real quick. And next slide. Okay. To be part of the show or ask questions or make comments or whatever, dial in 919-518-9773. Or even better, if you go on Skype and go to Computers 2K Voice and tune in there and ask comments, questions, whatever you'd like to do is great. Always looking for input from you out there in computer land and so forth. But also want to point out that any opinion that I give or opinion that someone on the show or some of the materials I use is strictly that. It's an opinion. It doesn't reflect any organization. It doesn't reflect Nissan Communications or anything else. It's basically the opinion of the person who's doing the show or the printed material that I use, which is, like I said, most of the time I have tried to investigate and make sure that it's the real facts and not the fake facts. As a big thing we have right now is all the fake news stuff. Well, I think it all got started with the Vietnam War. All right. The next one is, again, we've a last part of Me Lie. I promise you this is the last part. I do want to tell you there are some disturbing pictures there. Just want to tell you in advance, let you know there is some scenes that are hard to take, but it's part of the story we're trying to tell. So just want to let you know that you're warned and so forth. Now, okay. Now, we've been talking for 2 shows now about the atrocities of My Lai and some of the other atrocities we have talked about as far as the Vietnam War and so forth. We've talked about a little bit about the mindset of the soldiers that were involved, or all the soldiers that were involved in Vietnam. Now, when we talk about the mindset, we're trying to get the mindset of the soldiers to understand a little bit about why they did what they did. No matter what the mindset, it's still not there to justify it in any way. It was wrong. It shouldn't have happened. Bad leadership. Anytime you have bad leadership and people out there, you end up with a mob situation. And the actions of the armies in war have seldom been as humane as the modern American military. In the 20th century alone, there are boundless examples of horrific acts by the Germans, the Japanese, the Soviet Red Army in World War II, Korea in the 1950s, and others even later than that. I got to ask you a question. I need for you to give me an answer. We fight these limited wars lately. Give me your answer on this. What is more humane? Do whatever it is you need to win the war quickly, or fight a limited war that takes forever and probably kills more people? That's a dilemma. If you're going to have a war, and we're going to have a war because this country's always had wars, but is the war, if you're going to fight a war, which is the best? So go out there and do whatever you need to do to get it, win it, and get it over with, or just prolong it 10 years like with the wars we have now, or 15 years, 20 years like the Vietnam War went on. That's a hard question. I'm not certain there's a right or wrong question that, but if you go back and think about the movies and so forth you used to watch about the Romans and the soldiers and so forth. Battle then was really just total butchery. They'd go in and kill everything and kill the prisoners and the wounded and so forth. And in Vietnam specifically, the Communist forces regularly perpetrated atrocities on Americans as well as their Vietnamese civilian population, their own people. So as we've been talking about the different atrocities and so forth, the United States, I'm a veteran, American citizen. I was, by the grace of God, I was born here in America. I think it's the greatest country in the world. It has problems like anybody else. And when you put people in the military, they're just a micronism of what's going on around them in their country. And as I've said before, we've looked at the United States and its military black eyes in the Vietnam War, and we talked a little bit about North Vietnamese communists and what they did to its own people. We're going to go into a little bit more of that tonight. What I'm going to show you now is some of the instances that few in the media mention or investigate. Things that the media saw and were involved with, like Way during the Tet Offensive, which we'll get into, but you don't hear anything about them. But as we talk about this, we're not trying to justify what the Americans did at My Lai or the other three known atrocities and so forth. So what we're not trying to justify them at all, but they need to be part of the conversation of the atrocities in the Vietnam War. The first one I'm going to talk about here is the treatment of the communists did to American prisoners. Now, I'm going to recommend some books to you, which will kind of give background to the pictures here and what I'm going to tell you in a little bit. John M. McGrath, who was a POW, he wrote a book, Prisoner of War, 6 Years in Hanoi, and he even has, he actually drew pictures of men being tortured. You've had some POWs on this show in the past who talked about being tortured. Ernest Brace book, A Code to Keep. Nick Rose, 5 Years to Freedom, where he was kept in the tiger cages out in the jungles of Vietnam. Those are three excellent books to read if you want to know more about what they did to the American prisoners they kept, both at Hanoi Hilton, the other ones, as well as those who kept out in the tiger cages out in the jungles and so forth. It's no way to understand what one man would do to another man unless you read these books that people went through them. And it's amazing to me, the ones that I have met, that how they have gone on with their life and done well. Example, if you saw the movie We Were Soldiers Once and Young, or We Were Soldiers Once, that Mel Gibson playing Hal Moore, who recently passed away, and Joe Galloway, who lives now down in Mooresville, North Carolina. You saw the movie and so forth, but what they didn't show you was the NVA would go out and shoot the Americans who were wounded, so they couldn't be recovered or whatever. They'd come and shoot them in the back of the head, stick them with their bayonets and so forth. And how do we know that? Because most of the bodies recovered there were shot in the back of the head, execution style. In other locations, they found wounded American soldiers were tied to trees, tortured and murdered, parts cut off of them, stripped the skin and so forth. And then you had the targeted assassination of South Vietnamese anti-communist civilians and government military members. The North Vietnamese Vietcong and the NVA, two different groups, would go into villages, and the first thing they'd want to do is anybody that was educated, if it was a teacher, village elder, leader in any way whatsoever, they would do terrible things to them and their families and so forth. Now, the next one we're going to talk about, we've talked a little bit about in the past, 1968 Tet Offensive. That was when the communists who asked for a ceasefire during the Tet celebration. Tet is the biggest celebration of all of Vietnam, North and South. It's where all the families get together, food, fellowship, everything, all came together. But they decided to break the ceasefire agreement that they wanted to do. And they hit all the major cities in Vietnam and military bases. And Hue City was the original imperial city of Vietnam, period. Not North or South, but Vietnam, back when there was a king there. And the citadel itself has like 12-foot walls, about 12 foot high. So when the Viet Cong came in and took that over, the Vietnamese did not want the American government to go in there and rockets and airplane dropping bombs and so forth, because they wanted to save as much as the capital as they could and not destroy it during the battle and so forth. So it took a little longer to get it out. But after the Way City was taken and the Imperial Palace was retaken and so forth, they found 5,800 civil servants, teachers, and so forth, who were rounded up and executed. Some buried alive in mass graves, some tied up and shot in the back of the head during the 25 days that it took to get them back out. Now, in the picture there, if you can't read it, it says rows of coffins of victims of the 1968 Tet Vietcong Offensive. Bereaved relatives mourn their dead during mass funerals of 250 persons killed by Viet Cong. Funerals held October 1969, as bodies were only recently discovered. This was not the original. This was 5,800 they found, and then they found these others. You can see some of the bodies were lined up and so forth there. I mean, 5,800 of their own people. Again, we're talking about here the Tet Offensive 68, how the North Vietnamese Army regulars. This was not the Viet Cong. This was the North Vietnamese regulars, the guys who were trained soldiers and so forth, on orders from North Vietnam generals, war hero General Nguyen Duc. The orders were to round up and march the civilians to a dry riverbed and summarily execute them with bullets, bayonets, and clubs. Some were buried alive with their hands tied behind their backs. The only crime these people had were they were either believed in democracy or they were Christians. Kind of gives you an idea that like some of the things we're having going on today in the war. Another massacre was the Viet Cong massacre at Doc Son, a village in Vietnam, in Song Bay Province. 2 battalions of Viet Cong systematically killed 252 civilians with flamethrowers and grenades, a vengeance attack on a small hamlet less than a mile from the capital in Phuc Long Province. Those were, if I remember correctly, they were either Montagnards or Hmong people. Those were ethnic people there in Vietnam who fought for the United States. The survivors of Doc Son attack said the VC shouted their intention to wipe out the hamlet of Doc Son as they struck from surrounding jungles. A local defense force of 54 men, we used to call those rough puffs. Those are the guys that had, basically they were having a rifle and said this is how you shoot it and how to put bullets in there, and that was their training to protect their village. These 54 men with almost no training at all were only supposed to hold off 300 uniformed communists. And according to survivors, the VC ran up and down the hamlet streets, systematically burning more than half the 150 thatched homes in the community. Now this picture to me is pretty graphic. Many of the victims were burned to death in their homes. Others who fled to underground shelters died as flamethrowers, with the napalm-based fuel were directed into the small shelters. Other Viet Cong threw hand grenades into holes where families were covered. Now, this picture was from the Vietnam Center archives. I mean, that's how they treated their own people. Terrorism all over South Vietnam was carried on by the North Vietnamese. This was a floating ship. You see the picture here was a floating ship that a lot of dignitaries, Americans and other dignitaries went to have dinner and so forth, a very popular restaurant, and they bombed that, as you can see some of the bodies there. And this wasn't in Vietnam per se, but it was part of the communist movement, the Cambodian Khmer Rouge. If you've ever heard of the Killing Fields, if you haven't, you need to look it up. As a movie about the Killing Fields. I believe the American reporter recently died. There was a Cambodian young man who was a photographer. He now lives in the United States, but he spent a lot of time in prison until they finally got him out. So the Cambodians killed millions of their own people. The Viet Cong would put mines out around the villages and so forth. Providence is something like a state, but a lot smaller. Viet Cong mines killed 54, including 4 children and 18 wounded by 3 Viet Cong mines in Phu Yen Province. Mining the road was retaliation for an Allied operation regarding harvesting of the rice crop. This was an area that raised rice, but the Viet Cong would go in and steal the rice from the people so they didn't have anything to eat. So they imported 600 tons of rice monthly, just so the people there would have something to eat. And they knew the road and so forth, so the Viet Cong mined the road so that would trying to stop it. Now, in total, from 1957 to 1973, the Viet Cong assassinated 36,725 South Vietnamese and abducted, we don't know what happened to those, that's just 36,000 one we know about, 58,499 of their own people. Where do they go? Most of them nobody knows. The VC death squads focused on leaders at the village level and on anyone who improved the lives of the peasants, such as medical personnel, social workers, civil engineers, and school teachers. Communism has its best strength when you have an uneducated group. You had people that were educated. They understood the problems with communism, so they had to be gotten rid of. For the communist forces, atrocities were a matter of policy and were not hidden or punished. Now, if you go back to the atrocities we've talked about, the American government, there were trials. There was punishment. Maybe not the punishment that you thought there should have been, but there was punishment and the trials. The ones that the Marines had an episode where they came up with on their own and said, okay, we're going to do something about it, and those men did serve time in jail. Now, noted historian Robert Turner has said that Vietcong brutality was a key to their strategy. Their strategy was to go in and scare the villages to follow them. They made no distinction between combatants and non-combatants. In other words, it didn't make any difference whether that guy was a soldier or a villager. Their terror tactics were dictated by the North Vietnamese Communist Party, which controlled the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong were a separate group. That's where the guerrillas were, but then you had the NVA, who were well-trained soldiers. Most of the brutality that I saw was because of official party policy. That is, they were doing something because this is something the party told them to do, said Turner, who served in Vietnam. He is now a distinguished fellow of the Center for National Security Law at the University of Virginia School of Law. He studied the Vietnam, going on. He was a Vietnam veteran. And now let's talk about this one. Despite documentation of continuous commission of such atrocities and many more small-scale sadistic acts designed to terrorize U.S. troops and punish cooperating Vietnamese, many people still cling to the belief that United States troops were the barbarians, while the communist forces were the noble freedom fighters, because they call themselves the benevolent people of North Vietnam. Why is that we have that? This is partially a media-created paradigm, because it sold papers. It got people watching the TV, reporting over and over and over again of any story that could come up, trying to find any faults with the United States government, what we were doing there, and what South Vietnamese troops were doing. It's based on endless repeating of a few true stories of U.S. transgressions. In other words, after My Lai came back, we all were tasked with being baby killers and so forth. The creation of myths about other events that did not happen or widely exaggerated, often by the anti-war movement. As I mentioned before, John Kerry, who was part of the Winter Soldier Group, they went out and recruited people who never went to Vietnam, who stood up before Congress and testified to doing all kinds of atrocities in Vietnam when they were never there. And it was picked up by the war protesters as their thing. Also, being as a person who goes into a lot of the schools to talk about the Vietnam War and so forth. I have met a lot of wannabes. There's a lot of people out there, as we've talked about before, who claim to be Vietnam veterans. There were right at 3 million men and women who served in Vietnam. The last United States Census listed 13 million people who claim to be Vietnam veterans. A lot of those 10 million differences were people, as we call it, wannabes. And they tell you the best stories of the things they did in Vietnam. I went into a class one day, and there was somebody a couple of days before I got there, and the first question the students asked me was, how many did you skin and eat while you were over there? And I'm going, what are you talking about? And it seems that a wannabe was in the class a couple of days before and talked about skinning and eating the Vietnamese and so forth. I mean, the stories are just out there, but these elaborate stories give this wannabe a credibility because, you know, everybody called us baby killers and we were supposed to have done all these things like My Lai and so forth, and no mention ever whatsoever of the atrocities over there. We've talked about it early on the show. There is a museum at My Lai to show what happened there. They commemorate it every year on that date, but nothing is ever commemorated or mentioned about the 5,800 of their own people that they killed during Tet at Hue. That's just kind of ignored, like it didn't happen. Now, after the fall of Saigon to the communists, that was April 30th, 1975. All correspondents, news reporters, radio people, everybody, Red Cross, were all told to leave Saigon. Why? Why were they told they had to leave the country? Because the communists didn't want anybody to know what they were doing or going to do. On June 10th, 1975, both Hanoi and Saigon announced that 12 categories of people would face trials by people's tribunals. Of course, those tribunals were all headed up by the communists. Among those to be severely punished, the lackeys of U.S. imperialism, those veterans of Thu's puppet regime who failed to repent their crimes, and those who owed blow debts to the people and the past and present enemies of the government and revolution. If you read any history about World War II and the Hitler Youth, your neighbors would turn you in. If you made your neighbors mad, they would turn you in and tell them that you were either Jewish or you had collaborated with the Americans or whatever. That's kind of what it was there. You wanted to gain favoritism with the communists, you would turn your neighbor in and tell them about all those bad things your neighbor did and so forth. That was one of the problems there. Thousands of urban Vietnamese, those are the people living in Saigon and the other main cities, Hue, Da Nang, some of the others, Dalat, they had been forced to sell their homes and start over again in new economic areas. In other words, they were put on farms, communes, to farm and so forth. Following the fall of Saigon on April 30th, 1975, Vietnamese Communist government began to open hundreds of re-education camps throughout the country. Those camps, as Hanoi officially claimed, were places where individuals could learn about the ways of the new government through education and socially constructed labor. In other words, that was just nothing there. It was just like going to school and learning about communism and how to be a better citizen of the Communist Party and so forth. Well, that's not quite the way it went, but that's why they wanted to get all the journalists and anybody could get the word out, what was going on and so forth. In 1975, it was estimated that 1 to 2.5 million people, including former officers, religious leaders, intellectuals, merchants, and employees of the old regime, and even some communists, entered the camps in the hope that they could quickly reconcile with the new government and continue their peaceful life. See, some of the VC were not communists, they were nationalists. They wanted Vietnam to be one country under Vietnamese rule. They didn't want communists any more than anybody else did. So they in turn had to go to these re-education camps, and they were quite often told, well, you only have to be there 10 days. We're going to train you or teach you about how the communist works, and some of them spent years and years and years in these camps. This is some of the officers. This is another picture of one of the camps and so forth. I know former South Vietnamese soldiers who spent time at these re-education camps. You couldn't even call them slave labor camps because of things they did. They went out, they were given a stick and told by hand to take that stick and dig for landmines. Part of that was that they didn't have to shoot them that way, because if you stick a stick down and you hit the pin for the landmine, it goes off. They don't have to worry about taking more. But that was one of the camps they're showing there. This next picture on the top was some of the generals, the South Vietnamese generals who were at the re-education camp being trained to be communist. In fact, get where I can read this picture here. Re-education session for 26 generals of former South Vietnamese Army. Second from left is one-time defense minister Nguyen Hu Ko. I mean, he's having to sit in there, and down below, that group of pictures down, the people down below are some of the former officers of South Vietnam who are also being re-educated. Now, 1 out of every 3 Saigon families had a member in one of the camps. It wasn't just a few people, it was 1 out of every 3 families. According to French journalist Jean Latour, who made an automobile trip from Hanoi to Saigon in 1976. He visited some of these camps. After visit to new economic areas for former Saigon near people near Phan Thuet, Latour wrote that it was prefabricated hell and a place one comes to only if the alternative to it would be death. And a lot of the South Vietnamese people solved that problem because they committed suicide. People were detained in re-education camps, which were in no way similar to the show camps set up for the briefing benefit of visiting dignitaries and foreign reporters. See, as they were invited, people like Joan Baez and Jane Fonda there, and they showed them these model camps, they started inviting, because as the word started, the rumors were starting to get out about these re-education camps and all that was going on there, they started bringing in select reporters, their buddies. And they were taken to these wonderful show camps so they could come back and write how wonderful the people were being treated in these wonderful camps and so forth, and just with big educational place. Camps for former officers and functionaries of the Saigon government are usually located in malaria-infested jungle areas. One of my good friends was a major, Hin Vo. After Saigon fell, he fought on for another 30 days with his unit. He was a major. He went from a machine gun to 10 years in a slave labor camp in the jungles of North Vietnam. They gave you no medication. If you got injured or sick, tough. Thousands of camp inmates have died from lack of food, medicine, or clothing. Thousands committed suicide. Some were secretly liquidated. Others perished through stage accidents, like the stick with finding the landmines. For example, former officers were forced to deactivate minefields with their bare hands, so the regime would not have to waste a valuable bullet on them. And you can see what they've done to those guys tied on a post there. Now, that's not all that they did to them. We're going to talk a little bit more just here. After the officers had mostly been taken care of, in other words, they had all of them in their slave labor camp, the re-education camps. Then they turned it over to the journalists, authors, scholars, professors, anybody that was Western educated technicians, student leaders, third force leaders. Like 2,500 of those they put into re-education camps. There was no conciliation or forgiveness, no leniency, only a carefully concealed mass public purge. In other words, the Vietnamese didn't go in and say, okay, we forgive you. We're going to re-educate you and make you part of the community. Kind of like we're supposed to be prisoners now. What's the word when we take a prisoner and get him out and teach him to be a good guy? Repatriate. Okay. Anyway, we're going to train you to be a good citizen. And that's not exactly the way it worked. Starvation diets, overwork, disease, and harsh punishment resulted in high death rate of the prisoners. Well, according to the academic studies of American researchers, a total of 165,000 Vietnamese people died in those re-education camps. They were re-educated pretty hard. Now, all the officers didn't make it to those camps. A convoy of 150 former Saigon officers were massacred en route to a re-education camp, except for one. They thought he was dead. 4 U.S. trucks driven by ARVN, that's North Vietnamese Army drivers, all the officers were blindfolded with their hands tied behind their backs. The trucks were preceded by an armored car and a tank and followed by the same suddenly. In the ink dark of the countryside night, the leading tank and armored car sped up and the following tank and armored car opened fire on the convoy. The wounded were dispatched in place. All the prisoners were killed except that one, and he was taken care of by the locals. 10 days before that, another convoy went out, and nobody knows what happened to them because there were no survivors. Their wives have no idea what happened to them. So those that didn't even bother to take to the re-education camps, they re-educated them with tanks, blowing them up before they ever got into the camps. Most of the re-education camps were operated until 1986. That's when the United States kind of started talking about maybe we ought to open up relations with Vietnam again. Nguyen Van Linh became the General Secretary of the Communist Party. He began to close the harsher camps and reform the others. 2 years later, Washington and Hanoi reached an agreement that Vietnam would free all former soldiers and officials of the old regime who were still held in re-education camps across the country and allow them to immigrate to the United States under the Orderly Departure Program. Well, some of them did. Some of them stayed in the re-education camps long after that. As of August 1995, around 405,000 Vietnamese prisoners and their families were resettled in the United States. 405,000 Vietnamese came to America, that place that created all those atrocities, looking for freedom. Let's talk about some of these. I have another friend that was a boat refugee. She was from Dalat, which is inland. Her parents had a little bit of money. But if the communists found out that you were trying to escape, they would either kill you or take everything you had. So they were going to escape. They chartered a boat with some other people in Dalat. But they left Grandma behind. That way, if Grandma was behind and they got caught, they still had a place to live because Grandma wasn't trying to escape. So they got down to the coast, and the people at the coast realized that their dialect was different. So they knew there was a boat out there. So the people there at the coast who were already there swam out and took over the boat. The people of Dalat saw what was going on, and they left all their belongings on the shore and swam out and got on a boat. No food, no water. And the second day out, the engine went out, and they just floated for a while. And we're going to talk about what happens. A lot of them went out. Many Vietnamese made the decision to flee Vietnam. This was an illegal act under the communist regime, as I just mentioned. Many of these people took to fishing boats. Now, we're not talking about luxury liners. We're talking about fishing boats that you go out and fish for a couple of hours and come back in. They wanted to start a new life. They wanted to get away from communism. The fishing boats just were not suited for open water and they were totally overcrowded. And you can see that boat there. It's kind of crowded, y'all. No way with American government today, with all the rules and regulations, to let that many people get on a boat. I mean, just think about the bathroom facilities. There is no such thing as private. Eating food, drinking water. And one of the problems we had is a large number of the refugees who went out in these boats who were not supposed to have been out drowned. 1.5 million went out, and they say anywhere from 50,000 to 200,000 of them died on the ocean trying to get out. Now, what happened to them that went out there? Drownings accounted for the most deaths of the boat people, but you also had the Somalian pirates and other pirates out there who would go take whatever valuables they happened to have, because if they got left, they may have had something that was valuable. They were going to reset their life up. They took it. The pirates took it away with them. Some of them, they just took the women and made slaves out of them and sold them for slavery and so forth. But they kept coming. No food, no water quite often, but whatever it took to get away from communism and freedom. Now, make no mistake, there's a lot of people out there in the United States and other countries that enjoy the fact that hundreds of Vietnamese were murdered at My Lai, because that gave them validation for all the things that had been said by the war protesters and the peaceniks. They all come up with their assumed things we were going over. I had a woman tell me in 1990s that we were all baby killers because of My Lai. These people don't want to hear anything that might nullify their perception of their virtuous superiority. And what I'm showing here is the peace sign that was used so much. And I'm not saying all the peace groups were like this, but so many of them were. They were more interested in their own agenda than in what was really happening. They didn't want to hear about the admirable U.S., South Vietnamese, Australian troops, the Medicap units we sent in to take care of the villages and so forth with injections and medicine and so forth, the orphanages and schools and all that sort of stuff. They didn't want to hear anything about that. All they want to know about the atrocities that were routinely committed as a matter of policy. See, according to them, the United States government told us, Vietnam veterans, to go out and do these things. Didn't happen. It's interesting to look back today, that so many of these groups have done nothing to help the people of Vietnam. A good part of the help that's going to the people of Vietnam, not to the communists, but the people of Vietnam, are coming from Vietnam veterans, Southeast Asia veterans, like the organization I belong to, who we've been back and helped the kids over there and built 2 playgrounds, and helped them get back and forth to school, helped the blind school over there, and so forth. Those are people who are today helping the people of Vietnam. So many of these peace groups have disappeared. Now, there are some very good organizations over there who are still doing some good work, but the vast majority of them disappeared when the war ended or we came home. The American consciousness, those once active, concerned about the war, both Dove and Hawks, share a common interest in forgetting that faraway land of so many unpleasant memories. You know, let's forget about Vietnam and all together. Let's don't even think about the people that we walked off and left who couldn't get away, the people who couldn't get on a boat, the people who were too sick to get on the boat or had to stay behind like Grandma did. United States anti-war groups didn't want to be reminded of Vietnam for fear of having to admit that their marches, their demonstrations, successful cut the aid campaign resulted in deaths or detention of thousands of South Vietnamese. As we've said before on this show, when we pulled out, Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon told South Vietnamese government, we're going to continue helping you with materials, supplies, and so forth. Now, it has been proven that Richard Nixon went to North Vietnam before election and told them to do not sign a peace treaty until I get in. It is known fact and proven that Richard Milhouse Nixon went to South Vietnam leaders and said, do not sign a peace treaty before I get in office. I'll get you a better deal. When we signed that peace treaty, we allowed North Vietnam to still be soldiers in South Vietnam. The city of Dong Ha, where we built our last playground, was already in communist hands when the peace treaty. So then the Americans all pulled out. The Vietnamese fought very well for 2 years. They did something that nobody thought they could do. They hung in there and fought the communists with the Russians and the Chinese and the tanks and the airplanes and so forth that they were furnishing. And the United States government reneged on the money. In fact, when Gerald Ford went to Congress saying, this is the money we promised the South Vietnamese government and the South Vietnamese people, Congress actually got up and walked out on him. So the anti-war groups didn't want to hear all that. There's a lot of American soldiers killed who could have come home had it not been for the war protesters who kept prolonging the war. After the bombing at Christmas, the Viet Cong were ready to go to the peace table and say, we want peace. But the war protesters who protested at Christmas bombing gave the North Vietnamese what they needed to continue on and hang in there a little bit longer until Kissinger and Nixon sold them out. U.S. officials also were anxious to contain the unhappy news from Vietnam because it revealed how inadequate the American evacuation program was. You see, the ambassador, American ambassador to Vietnam at that time, he refused to believe that Saigon was going to fall. He refused to order evacuation. That's why you see the pictures of the evacuation, not from the American Embassy, by the way. That is the CIA building behind the American Embassy. That building is still there. I have pictures of it. The American Embassy is gone. But I do have pictures of the building that is showing the helicopters get on. I did have pictures of the American Embassy when I was there also. But he did not want to go. In fact, if you go back and look at some of the shows that I did with Brigadier Norman Gaddis, he was a prisoner of war, but he was by that time freed and he was still in the military. He was at the Pentagon. The president called, he was on phone duty or whatever it was called that back that time. And his ambassador left yet? No, sir, he has not left yet. And he said, tell him to get the hell out of there now. So Norman had to call back to the embassy in Vietnam and tell the ambassador, get on the damn helicopter or else. So a lot of people died as a result of the United States not being prepared. In fact, how it looked as we were escaping Vietnam at the end. And we left a lot of good Vietnamese who we had promised a lot of things to. Also, one of the tragic things was they did not get to burn all the secret files. There was a program conducted by the American government in Vietnam called the Phoenix Program. That program is where CIA, snipers, and other special guys would go out and find the leaders of the Communist Party in the villages and so forth and assassinate them. 30,000 of these people, list of their names were left there. 30,000 Vietnamese who were part of the Phoenix program were executed because the United States government forgot to burn the records. This next picture is a picture of us getting the American Embassy sign out. A full report, as I just mentioned, of the massacre of those 30,000 Phoenix cadres is said to have reached the desk of the French ambassador to Saigon by late 1975. He communicated it to Washington, where nothing was done about it. Washington didn't care about the 30,000, I guess, people who fought for the United States and name left on the list. How would you like to know that your name was left on the list, but you couldn't get on one of those helicopters to get out? The American media also seemed to want to forget Vietnam. Scores of former concentration camp inmates, Vietnamese who escaped not in April 1975, but after communism had been in power a while, arrived in the United States but they got very little, if any, attention about the re-education camps, the process, what was going on and so forth. It's like they didn't care. Let's just try to forget Vietnam altogether, like it never happened. Now, the Frenchman Jean Latours wrote a book, or wrote a story, Harsh Story of Life in Cambodia, and Father Andre Gelina's account of life in South Vietnam after the takeover, reprinted in the New York Review of Books. Let me tell you what the good father had to say. Father Andre Gelina's, forgive me if I'm pronouncing his name wrong. I'm really bad on pronouncing names, but you'll get the gist of the story. You probably don't know how to pronounce it either. A Vietnamese-speaking Jesuit priest who was expelled from Saigon said as many as 20,000 Vietnamese committed suicide once the communists took over. 20,000 who didn't want to even think about being communist. In the article that New York Review reprinted, Galinas wrote that one former policeman killed his 10 children, his wife, and his mother-in-law, and then killed himself. One father, after explaining it was necessary to put an end to their torment, passed out poison soup to his family. 12 monks and nuns immolated, burned themselves at a fire at their Duxo Pagoda in Phu Hep, Can Tho Province on November 2nd, 1975, to protest religious persecutions. Okay. Now this is a story of a young man who was a boat person. Leaving South Vietnam during the fall of Saigon, there was no place to hide. South Vietnamese soldiers were taking off their uniforms and trying to find civilian clothes to put on so nobody would know they were soldiers. This is one of the many stories. This one's of a 13-year-old named Quan Bui. And this is his story. The streets were in chaos, a sea of people frantically trying to evacuate families out of the city. Quan Bui could hear the rumble of tanks and armored military vehicles as North Vietnamese troops advanced into the capital. In the distance, bombs exploded, smoke filled the horizon. On that day, late April in 1975, it happened to be April 29th, Bui and his parents, along with his 3 brothers, sisters, aunts, and uncles, everyone on his mother's side, fled Saigon as the communist troops of North Vietnam poured into the capital city. In less than 24 hours, they would overtake the city and proclaim its liberation. And you can see some of the Russian tanks coming in. Bui is old enough to realize the danger around him, but not wise enough to comprehend that the life he had known up to then in his South Vietnam homeland was about to change forever. Bui is overcome with tears. He recalls the event that began that day when his parents rushed him and his siblings from their home. As you can see, the little picture of all the people on the road trying to get by, it was total chaos. This was not Bui and his family. This was just happened to be a family that was trying to escape. That was a man, his wife, and 5 children on the motorcycle trying to escape. Bui on the day embarked on a uniquely American experience shared by thousands of South Vietnamese war refugees who staked a new life in the United States after the communist regime captured their homeland. For Bui, the event of the 2 days that Saigon officially fell to communist troops of North Vietnam and the provisional revolutionary government ushered in a life-transforming journey that to this day continues to affect his life. He is proud to call himself American, as all the Vietnamese Americans I have met, but remains deeply respectful to the traditional heritage of his ancestral homeland. They are Americans, but they're still Vietnamese in their heart. Fleeing Saigon. Quan Bui described his dramatic escape from Vietnam during the fall of Saigon. On the morning of April 29, 1975, one of Bui's uncles arrived at his home accompanied by South Vietnamese troops. The family had to leave, the uncle insisted. They had to flee. Each could take 2 bags. He would transport the family to Saigon by a jeep. Now, Bui and his brother got mad with his mother because she was insisting they live, so they wouldn't talk to her. On this morning, military officials made a frantic push to rescue all remaining Americans and some Vietnamese via helicopter. Bui's uncle now knew the time had come to his family to flee. In other words, he saw the Americans getting out. He knew it was time for them to go. The ride from Buey's home in Gia Dinh to Saigon took approximately half an hour by car. Buey's mother, Fingo Buey, had long known that sooner or later she would have to take her family out of Vietnam. A native of North Vietnam, she fled North Vietnam in 1957. She feared for her life. When the Bueys reached Saigon, they were stopped by police and military officers. They refused to let them through. They had no papers. Years later, they would learn that the uncle gave these guards all the money, keys to the house, and deeds to the land just to let them through. They had been willing to give up everything for freedom. They sit there in the car for 4 hours, 3 to 4 hours, waiting for something to happen. They didn't know what to do. The uncle finally waved them through. And they were seeing people trying to get through the embassy and so forth. But somehow or another, I guess through the uncle who was in the military, they were assigned to a military boat. But they got permission to board the boat. Buey says the boat pulled out to sea that night as passengers crammed on board. We were sitting on top of each other, literally, Buey says. The boat had not gone far when the captain informed his passengers that 3 out of the 4 engines had malfunctioned. The captain's hopes to reach into South China Sea and international waters before the Vietnamese troops caught them all hinged on that one engine. On the morning of April 30th, they were still in the harbor. Buey's family and all the other people still in Vietnam saw the Communist national flag raised over Saigon. Buey says, I remember we didn't have food. We had very little food. Buey says there was rice for 3 to 4 days and literally no water. Every morning my mom said to go rinse your mouth, but it was with seawater, salt water. And at that time I told my parents, I'm not doing it, my lips are cracked. The heat and sun were blistering. The Bueys were on the first deck of the boat, exposed to all the harsh elements, along with all the other people that were packed in with them. There was no place to hide from the heat. Miraculously, the boat reached international waters and was found by a Filipino cargo ship. The ship's crew transported half the refugees to its ship. We thought we were rescued, but we found it was just temporary, Buey says. We still didn't have enough food, but we had more than we had before. Now, I thought this was kind of ironic. It's hard to believe that Buey's family got most of their information about what was going on in the war, just like people back home in the United States did, by the TV. So they didn't get good news either. They didn't know what was going on half the time. Like so many young people of his generation, Buey had witnessed the war on television. His uncles had been in the military and talked to him about the war and about how they escaped from the North Vietnamese. Buey knows that at the time, neither he nor his older brother grasped the severity of the situation. I told Mom it couldn't be that bad. We just changed governments. It's not that bad, Mom. Why do we have to go? Why do we have to leave everything to get on a boat where we don't know what our destination is? They spent several days in the boat before being rescued by a U.S. Army boat that transported them to Guam. That's when my mom whispered to my dad, "We are free." That's when we knew that everything was okay, Buey said. A new life begins. Buey spent 3 months in Guam before they were flown to a refugee camp at Fort Indiantown Gap. Before long, the American authorities came to him and said, we're going to send you to Northbrook, Illinois. They didn't ask him, where would you like to go? They had Americans who were willing to sponsor them. They had no idea where Northbrook, Illinois was, but they knew they were going because they were afraid if they didn't say yes, that they would get back on the list. Now, I know some of you out there, you younger people out there, don't know what an atlas is. It was a book that has maps all over the world, and they tried to look up that town, and they couldn't find it in there. But they knew it had to be better than what they were going for. So, Vietnam continues to this day to pull at Buey's heartstrings. He keeps up with the news out of his ancestral homeland through YouTube. It's still a country with no freedom of religion, no freedom of speech, he says. It's a difficult issue. I try to talk to my kids about it. The kids asked, Dad, why did you leave Vietnam? Buey says he does his best to explain, especially the part about the lack of freedom there. I say, you go back to Vietnam, you can't just say what you want and express what you think are right or wrong, he says. They will arrest you regardless of whether you are a U.S. citizen. They don't care. I've talked to the Vietnamese in Vietnam today, and it's one of the freedoms they still don't have. I don't take a lot of things for granted, it says. When you say freedom, you really mean freedom, he says. I want to do this tomorrow. I'll be able to do it. If I don't like something, I can express it the way I feel without being persecuted. If I lived in my country, I wouldn't be able to do that. What you see there is the South Vietnamese flag, former South Vietnamese flag. Okay. Buey says the only flag that we recognize is yellow with 3 stripes. He says, I said to my kids, this is the only simple reason why. This flag recognizes freedom and our current Vietnamese flag does not. I said, I don't care what flags fly over my country as long as my people are able to talk and express freedom and to be able to have religious freedom. Every time I talk about it, I choke up. And every time I look at the flag, the original flag with yellow and 3 red stripes, I really appreciate my parents' sacrifice for us. Buey struggles even now to articulate to his sons why he left, why his countrymen would raise arms against each other. Again, we're talking about American consciousness. These once actively concerned about the war, both doves and hawks share a common interest in forgetting that faraway land we talked about. Okay. Talk about some of the myths. There's a very good website out there. It's called Vietnam Veterans of Factual History. And the myth was, today, even still today, U.S. military routinely used inhuman tactics on the people of South Vietnam when the Vietnamese communists were benefactors. In other words, the communists went into the village and helped them out and so forth. No one has ever found any document stating it was U.S. policy to commit atrocities. Nowhere was it shown that that was standard operating procedure. There are numerous documents exist that shows that it was official policy for the North Vietnamese government and its military to commit atrocities. The worst known incident of atrocities by U.S. military was My Lai, where 504 civilians were massacred. The worst known incident by the communists were during Tet and Way, where there were 5,000 plus, 5,800 massacred. Another myth. The rules, oh, by the way, the rules of engagement in Vietnam were so strict that President Johnson once boasted that the U.S. Air Force could not hit an outhouse without his permission. As we've talked about before, they decided in Washington what we could hit and what we couldn't hit, what we could shoot and what we couldn't shoot. They controlled it. Myth 2. There was no bloodbath in Vietnam after the communists took over South Vietnam. You remember all the journalists and everybody were told to leave. 65 to 100,000 South Vietnamese were executed after the takeover. 165 died in re-education camps due to torture, lack of medical care, disease, and starvation. 250,000 died trying to escape the communists by boats. By some estimates from 1975 to today, there have been over 1.5 million deaths result of the communists. My thoughts and conclusions, you should come up with your own. War itself is an atrocity. Non-combatants die as well as the military. But sometimes the peace is more deadly and costly to the non-combatants than the war itself. More South Vietnamese died after the war was over than during the war. Freedom is a precious thing, and people in all nations will sacrifice whatever they have to do to be free. You don't try to hear of too many people trying to escape from the United States by a boat to go to Cuba. My Lai, as well as other atrocities were committed by both sides, were wrong. Nothing can justify them. But maybe we can understand the reason for them and maybe eliminate some of them from happening in other wars. Freedom is not free. Again, let me go back real quick because I'm running out of time. The atrocities were bad. But if there was as much atrocities committed by the American soldiers as the peaceniks and the reporters all reported, there's no way 250,000 Vietnamese would die trying to get here, because they would think that this was as bad as worse country than the communist. This is the show tonight, and like I said, it's taken 3 shows to do this, but I hope you understand now a little bit more about atrocities, how they come about, that they'd come about, but it wasn't an everyday thing for the Americans, but it was part of the policy. Thank you for tuning in. The next show will be on something near and dear to me called the Selective Service, the draft, and so forth. We'll see you May 24th, same place, at Nissan Communications International Headquarters. Thank you. Good night. Night, 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 night.
You're tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. If you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it in the archives section on nissancommunications.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Sponsored by Atomos.com, makers of quality video recorders and converters, CarolinaApparel.com, and DeltaForce.net.